A very warm welcome to our fourth and final Ethical Finance Roundtable of 2020. Most of you will know me by now, but for those who don't, my name is Graham Burnside and I am a senior advisor with Jeffy. As this is, as I say, the final roundtable of the year, following last year's pattern, we're departing a little from our usual format, and today's event takes the form of a slightly more informal discussion between our guest speakers. We've given this the label of a festive fireside, as you will have seen, but let me reassure you that in accordance with the spirit of these gatherings, the fireside in question is a purely metaphorical one, and no fossil fuels will be consumed. We're honoured and delighted that Dame Susan Rice is joining us this afternoon to lead the discussion. Following on her distinguished banking career, Dame Susan now holds an entire suite of chairs. Most relevant to today's event, she currently chairs the Banking Standards Board and also the Scottish Fiscal Commission. And not least, we're proud to say that she also chairs the advisory board of our own dear Jeffy. She will be joined on today's panel by Willie Watt, the inaugural chairman of the recently launched Scottish National Investment Bank, and by Andrew Wilson, who amongst many other roles chairs Scotland's Sustainable Growth Commission. And Dame Susan will introduce them both more fully in a moment. Before I hand over to her, can I deal very briefly with a few housekeeping points? Firstly, one of the advantages of a virtual event like this is that we can ask questions in real time. And as I'm sure most of you will know, this can be done via the chat function, which you'll find at the foot of your screen or somewhere around about it at any rate. So can I encourage you to send in your questions as we go along? Our team of IT elves are standing ready behind the scenes to get these organized, and we'll tackle as many as we can in the final part of the session. Secondly, we will be recording the event, and in a few days' time, it will be available on Jeffy's YouTube channel and also on our own recently launched EFX platform. Finally, feel free to share any thoughts as we go along with other attendees, again, via the chat function. And for those of you who do such things, with the wider world via Twitter at Finance for Change, that's Finance Figure 4 Change, using the hashtags Ethical Finance RT and Path to COP26. And for those of you who, like me, didn't entirely follow that, these details are being circulated to you as I speak. Well, as anyone who, like me, has reached a certain age will know, one of the consequences of getting older is that it becomes increasingly hard to keep track of the passing years and to remember what happened when. Whatever our age, however, I think we will all agree that 2020 has been a year no one is likely to forget. Like so much of the rest of our lives, these roundtables have made the move from real to virtual, and indeed we have all migrated to Planet Zoom. Some of the changes forced upon us have turned out to have unexpected advantages. In our case, it has given these events a much wider reach and a much larger audience than they formerly had. In fact, people are joining us today from no less than 25 countries, which is tremendous. That certainly applied too to Jeffy's flagship event of the year, our annual Ethical Finance Conference. This year's gathering back in October was probably the most successful we've had. In general, though, I think it can safely be said that few will be sorry to see the end of this year. So, as we look towards its dying days and the season of being jolly careful, we look forward this afternoon to 2021 and ask the question, are there reasons to be cheerful? Clearly, there look to be some, with vaccines shimmering on the near horizon, and later in the year, prospects, we certainly hope, for real progress at COP26. which will of course be taking place here in Scotland. It can't be denied though that there are black clouds looming too, as the full economic fallout from the fight against COVID becomes ever more apparent, and climate and nature challenges seem ever more imminent. And that's without mentioning Brexit. So the question for our panel today is, should we be on the side of the friend of Dr. Johnson, who you may recall said he tried to be a philosopher, but cheerfulness was always breaking in? Or do we feel more in tune with Robert Burns's ploughman, who, as he tells us, backward cast my ee on prospects drear, and forward though I cannae see, I guess and fear. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Graham. What a way to start. Let me first say good afternoon to all of you, or morning or evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. As I was thinking about how to kick off this discussion, a phrase kept running through my head, so I think I need to say it so it will stop running. Albert Camus, the French author and philosopher, once wrote, and I translate quite loosely, "Everything's already been said, but since no one was listening, it'll have to be said all over again." My hope for today is, while we might repeat some of the stories of what's happened in the past and certainly what's gone on this year, that we will look firmly in front of us at what might be able to happen next year, at what we want to have happen, and what we ourselves can help to make happen. Therein lies hope and optimism and energy and excitement, and we could all certainly use some of that. Now, I've just said the word what 5 times, but I'm a what and a how person, because the two for me have to go together. So I'm pleased to be joined on this virtual platform by 2 people I've known for quite a while, and I think very highly of. Willie Watt was recently named, as Graham told you, inaugural chair of the Scottish National Investment Bank, Scotland's brand new development bank. He comes to that role from a highly successful career in venture capital and fund management, where he measured success by long-term sustained value created by an incessant focus on the impact of investments on people's lives, on society, the economy, and the environment. Andrew Wilson is founding chair of Charlotte Street Partners, a strategic communications consultancy, having started life as an economist, followed by a career spanning politics and business. He's someone who continues to influence policy and articulately makes the case for sustainable capitalism, which he did as chair in 2018 of Scotland's Sustainable Growth Commission. Now, I mentioned the how and the what a minute ago. I believe that Willie can help us understand something of how a mission-led financial institution can support ambitious businesses in Scotland in a way where we salute success only if the economic outcomes are fair and inclusive. And I trust Andrew will be able to give us sight of the what. What are the opportunities which might help us ignite the Scottish economy as we look ahead? The how and the what. But I'm also hoping that we can dwell to some extent on the importance of where, because I think we often overlook the role of place in innovation and change, and indeed that change at the end of the day is delivered by people who are in a place. How often do we come across the view that what's good for me comes before what's good for the world? I mean, it's easier to salute change that's broad and comes from above because everybody's responsible for it. It's much harder to make it happen on the ground where we, any of us, actually are. Let me elaborate on that thought by drawing together a few threads. The first thread is COP26, which happens next year. COP26 is really important. It comes not only after the worst of COVID, I hope, when we all hope we'll see burgeoning economic activity, but also after 6 years of what we might call episodic change since COP21 in 2015. So there's a lot to do. Hosted by the UK, it's being held here in Scotland, in Glasgow, in just under a year. The biggest gathering of world leaders ever in the UK. A moment of hope, a chance to breathe more life into the most urgent of challenges, a chance to make bigger strides in moving this agenda on, a chance that countries from around the world will again join forces to commit and then act. There's always a lot of hype around COP gatherings, but we've learned that actions don't always follow quite as quickly or smoothly as one would hope. So there is indeed a lot to do next year. Now I'll move from this international spotlight to another thread, a national one. For us in the UK, our focus as we come out of COVID next year is on rebuilding and leveling up, trying to make those forces go hand in hand, rebuild in a way that levels up. And of course, nations are made up of regions and cities and rural areas and local communities. They're made up of places. So another thread. I'm on the advisory board of an adjunct to the UK's Climate Change Committee, what's called PCAN, PCAN, or a Place-Based Climate Action Network. PCAN considers how to solve environmental challenges more effectively through public and private collaborations, through place-based approaches in order to change the right things in the right places for maximum impact. It's explored capital allocation as proposed. One way to close the gap between intention and implementation is to follow 5 principles. Nick Robbins has asserted that finance needs to be green, just, resilient, rooted, and responsive, rooted in places and responsive to the needs there. Work has been done on the importance of context and understanding climate risk and shaping local decision-making and aligning changes with local needs, on building climate resilience knowledge from the ground up. These themes are true of places anywhere and give us different slant on how to make things happen. And then drawing on another thread, I come to Scotland. We often talk about Scotland's abundant resources, mainly water and wind, that can be mobilized in the name of climate change and net zero. Staying with the climate theme, we have some exemplar activity here. And forgive me for mentioning an organization where, again, I chair the board, which is Scottish Water. Our job is to provide plentiful and safe water for everyone in Scotland, not an insignificant responsibility. We've got 30,000 miles of water pipes underground, almost as many of sewage pipes, many dating from Victorian times. We've got water and wastewater works all over the country with internal kit of every shape and form. These all need to be improved, updated, replaced, made fit for the future, and we need to do that now. We know that major infrastructure work typically requires a lot of carbon. That's a big challenge. At the same time, the organization's formally committed to net zero within the next 2 decades. And we've chosen to follow the more difficult road because we believe that's the one that will have a genuine impact on the environment as well as the economy. The easy road would be substitution, plant a lot of trees. But instead, the company is intent on bringing its climate commitment into decisions on every aspect of its work, on the nature of the work and the priority given to it. The commitment to renew infrastructure may be top down, but the work is bottom up. The work is local on the ground. It needs to reflect our climate commitment. We need to carry people with us place by place. So now let me turn to my 2 colleagues to talk briefly about their work. I'll get a conversation going once they've finished, but we want to hear from you. So please do submit questions you have and we'll weave them into our conversation. So Willie, first over to you to tell us about Scotland's new development bank, your missions, your funding, and your approach.
Thank you, Susan. I think you mentioned there that the world is in part made up of nations and regions, and the development bank that I chair, the Scottish National Investment Bank, is certainly a regional development bank for Scotland. We are concerned with rebuilding and levelling up, which I think is a concern not only of development banks in a UK context, but actually right across the globe. We have just launched the bank. We launched in this month, and we are funded by the Scottish Government to the tune of $2.6 billion over the next 10 years. One of the things that's really interesting about the bank is that it is mission-based. It is not going to try and do all things for all people. It is going to focus on 3 missions which deal with the grand challenges that Scotland has faced structurally and continues to face structurally going into the future. And those challenges are the transition to net zero carbon position, the investment in place to tackle inequality, and the investment in innovation to build healthier and wealthier populations in our country and to stimulate knowledge-based companies and to change the shape of our business structure. We will invest commercially in equity and debt, and we aim to combine financial returns, real financial returns, with mission impacts. We don't see this as an either-or thing. We think it's perfectly justifiable and indeed necessary to seek both a financial return and an impact return in all our investments. We plan to be a cornerstone investor, a catalytic investor, a pioneering investor, not a lender of last resort. We'll work with private sector capital to attract and deploy private capital alongside our public capital. And over time, we will build our own investment management capability to manage external capital to augment the government funding that we have been given. We are owned by the Scottish Government 100%, but we operate independently from government. We're a public limited company, and we have an independent board made up of professional experts from the world of development finance, venture capital, private equity, and infrastructure. Our aim, we are a startup, as I said earlier on, and our aim is to become financially self-sustainable over the next 5 years and to contribute to major improvements in the net carbon zero position for Scotland, its inequality, and to foster innovation in our companies. So that, Susan, is an overview of the Scottish National Investment Bank and how it fits within the infrastructure that you mentioned in your introduction.
Willie, thank you very much for that. If you can guide the bank over the next 5 years or so with the clarity that you've just described it to us now, you'll be in a very good place. So good luck with that. And now, Andrew, can I turn to you and ask you to share with us some of your thinking about the opportunities or indeed the prompts that we might have with us today, or we might be looking into, that will actually get us going next year and where those could take us.
Thank you, Dame Susan, and thanks to Jeffy for the opportunity to be here. It's wonderful to be speaking from the depths of a Scottish winter to so many countries around the world on such important issues. I suppose to answer the entreaty from Graham at the start, which is reasons to be cheerful, and it's been hard, hasn't it, to be cheerful in this past year. But I think there's never been a better time to make big changes, to take a risk, to start a business or another initiative, to make big policy change. Because normally in our country, and I think in many countries, the most powerful force is what we did yesterday, because it tends to be what we did today and then what we'll do tomorrow, or we'll iterate. But now is an era where reform is upon us. We have to reform. We know this, we knew it already, but the crisis of COVID has accelerated many of the changes that we knew were needed already. So climate, you've already mentioned, inequalities by gender, geography, by generation, which is really important for us to consider, all accelerate with COVID, particularly acute in our little corner of the world here in the United Kingdom. The acceleration, unfortunately, of deglobalization, which is a populist response to some of the problems that were there already, not least in inequalities between countries, but it's here, it's happening. Barriers to trade are going up. Brexit is an expression of that, but we saw already. Changes in the United States may help, but deglobalization does appear to be the next phase after a period of excess of significant globalization. And so, you know, looking into the future, to Graham's quote from Burns, which we love, we no longer need to look into the future and guess and fear. We have to look into the future and determine what we want it to be. One of the risks just now, certainly here, but I suppose in most countries, but certainly in the UK, one of the risks is that as we come out of the crisis of COVID, that the orthodox thinking of Treasury and others means that we tighten our belts too quickly. It's really interesting that in the autumn, even the IMF, which had argued in the global financial crisis for what became known as austerity, but for public debt to be cut quickly, they are now arguing that we should keep the taps open, not just on life support, but in the recovery for what comes next. And I think that's a really important emerging thought. And it's one that we should support, because whilst of course debt adds to the burden on the next generation and therefore can be bad for the inequality between generations, it also can be powerful if it's channeled into investment. So we need to take what is the one silver lining of the crisis, is that for most countries, and indeed for many companies, debt is historically cheap. In the United Kingdom, just for the government, in the 15 years to 2025, the overall level of national debt is projected to have risen in that period by 30%. But in the same period, the cost of servicing that debt and the debt interest will have fallen by half. So whilst there is a worry on the level, in actual fact, in historical context, given the cost, there is an opportunity here for us to be bold and not to waste that money by just spending it, but to use it for investment, not only on the life support, which is still running here in the UK and will run into the spring, hopefully won't be needed much longer than that because of what we hope from a vaccine. But what we really want to see next is investment in the transformation. Now, Willie's part of it. Susan, in your company, Scottish Water, you've identified another, which should be part of it. Why wouldn't we invest now to transform in the way that you're saying? In the private sector too, there are huge opportunities. Only yesterday, the Committee on Climate Change, which Susan referred to, launched its 6th carbon budget for the UK. Now, for us in Scotland, the Committee on Climate Change is extra potency because its chief exec, Chris Stark, is a Scot from Glasgow who was an important civil servant in the Scottish Government on energy and climate change before he took his role. But that's a really important report. If you haven't read it, read it, because what it identifies is that with a relatively small investment, roughly 1% of wealth in the UK, we can get our emissions down by 78% by 2035 compared to 1990. So that's a 15-year acceleration. Now that is, for those of us who have children who bother us every day about the inaction of the older generations on climate change, that's one of the most optimistic things I've heard in many, many months, indeed in many years. So that's big. I think the other thing to be optimistic about is, whilst the world deglobalizes and the big blocs, the big countries, how to put it, assert their might, there is an opportunity for smaller countries to combine and collaborate on values. We don't need to be next to each other. We don't need to be geographically contiguous. We can collaborate on values, and there's an interesting emerging one there between New Zealand, Iceland, and Scotland on the well-being economy to be noticed. And then finally, I suppose, again, a big theme for us here in Scotland is the natural economy. I noticed somebody mentioning natural capital in the chat. I'd like to get us all to think of the natural economy as basically everything that would engage sustainably the natural resources that we have at our disposal. Now, water could be seen as a huge asset for the future, as you know yourself, Susan, but that, you know, Scotland has about 1/5 of the natural capital of the United Kingdom, even though we only have 8% of the population. So I'd like to see us thinking carefully about how we steward that, how we bring skills, research, and other commercial opportunities to it. So that would be my thinking. I think the biggest bedevilment of public policy making, and indeed of business growth everywhere, has been the tyranny of short-termism. Now we have in front of us the necessity to think for the long term and to transform, and it's a generation's work. Transforming ourselves takes time, and to bring the population, citizens with us, we need to be honest about that. We need to tell the truth about it, not promise jam tomorrow, promise hard work over a generation, and ultimately we can get not just this country, but hopefully many countries to a level of civilization which the population deserves. And that will also involve proper engagement with developing countries. One of the most wonderful things I read through the crisis was a piece in the Financial Times by Raghuram Rajan, who many will know as the former chief economist of the IMF and central bank governor of India, now in Chicago. And he was pointing out that if we don't support the developing world in the crisis, then the problems that they have won't stay in the developing world. They will be visited everywhere else. And I think it's so important as we focus on rebuilding ourselves that we keep a big eye on everyone else as well. And that's the final point to start with, I think, Susan, from me.
Muted, so I'm off mute. You cannot have a Zoom call without someone telling you to get off mute. But thank you very much for those thoughts and those views, and they really do provide, if you will, a different way of looking and thinking about the challenges we have ahead of us. We have quite a few questions that have come in, a lot of them about the bank, Willie, but I want to start with something a little bit more general, if that's okay. And Willie, maybe I'll turn to you first, and Andrew, like you to come in as well on this. What are your thoughts, I think, in the bank, or more generally, about balancing the mission orientation with commercial return? This is a space I personally have worked in finance for a number of years, being a founding director of Charity Bank and Big Society Capital, and worked in the US in this sphere. And I'm really fascinated by it. And I'm just, tell me what you think about that kind of balance and how you achieve that.
It's a good question, Susan, and I kind of flagged it up in my introduction, the way I felt about it. I've been working in finance for over 30 years. And up until maybe 10 years ago, there was a big debate that whether you could actually, it was an either or thing. Either you looked for positive ESG type impacts, or you maximized returns. And, you know, there's been quite a lot written recently about, there was an interesting article in the FT the other day about, you know, Friedman, and the job of the corporation is to maximize profit. And that's pretty much its only job. Well, I don't think it's an either or thing anymore. I think that particularly with the evidence from research and indeed from my own investment career and those of others, that essentially good governance, being socially responsible, running a sustainable business, all of these things are the paths to a more profitable and literally sustainable future. So my view is that even in a small nation like Scotland, we can find businesses that are operating in a sustainable way and that are linked to, for example, places of inequality, or have an innovative business model, or are working in clean tech or industrial decarbonization. And we can make investments in those companies that will deliver positive returns for the people of Scotland, but will also deliver positive mission-based impacts. And in some cases, we will be able to cover multiple more than one of the three missions in the same investment. So, I guess that's the way I would look at this. I don't know if that's helpful.
No, I think that's very helpful. Andrew, you can come in and say something about that area if you'd like, but I want to pick up on a question that's come in from Susan Murray at the David Hume Institute, because it builds on something you said. With the Climate Change Commission report being published on the same day as the Wealth Tax Commission in the UK, do the combined findings make a one-off wealth tax more politically palatable?
Well, that's to the point. Let me come back to that in a second. Just if I may, Susan, just follow on from Willie's excellent points. Some observations. Most companies die, to Friedman's point, and the average tenure of a shareholder in the United Kingdom in a public company is 6 months. So if we think long term, if you follow Willie's guidance, you're more likely to make profits sustainably. The banks were all hugely profitable, pursuing profit and return. And then 2008 happened, and it turns out they weren't. And that wasn't just 2008, they weren't profitable. It turns out they were behaving unsustainably and unprofitably in the lead into 2008. So the profits weren't real. They were a chimera. And I think that's important. Here in Edinburgh, we've got a couple of great examples of long-term thinking at the moment. That Leapfrog Investments, which launched the biggest impact investment fund, private fund last year, global organisation, London, Australia, elsewhere, with an office and investors here in Edinburgh, investing in the developing world and commercial opportunities. Great example, and they will make money. They will make money because they actively manage it. Baillie Gifford, well known, I think, to many people on this call, one of the most successful investment asset managers in the world, privately held here in its partnership in Edinburgh, had their best 6 months in the middle of this crisis, because their foresight to buy into many of the more sustainable tech opportunities. But under Andrew Cave, they're a good friend of mine in governance terms. They're also creating the sort of ESG funds, specific funds, and transforming their analysis, and that's very hopeful. So those observations. Then to Susan's question on the wealth tax, I mean, a specific wealth the history of wealth taxes isn't a happy one in most countries where they've happened, because they've tended to have been presaged by capital flight as people sought to avoid them. So the idea, however, is that there's a bargain to be struck here between generations. And if you actually, just to be quite parochial, here in Edinburgh, there is a small number of people who inherit a wonderful property market, inherit wonderful property in that, and therefore enjoy a good life. And then there's everyone else, with the British obsession with investing in housing. The average age of a first-time buyer here is now 38. So people are struggling to access it, and it's unfair. And the access to equity, the access to investment, which transforms people's opportunities, is limited. And that's something, again, we should be and could be thinking about. Whether the specific mechanism of a one-off tax could be legitimate, could work, and could be viewed as sustainable, I think that's worth starting a discussion on. It would be highly controversial in our system, but why would we not ask ourselves the question of that? People used to, one of the things that cuts against human nature is to not allow people to pass what they've created over their life to their kids. Obviously, the human condition is you want to help your kids get on, but that phenomenon has probably set Britain's economic growth and productivity back, because it has meant that the wealth of the Industrial Revolution was then spent rather than reinvested and reinvigorated for the country. So there's something in that, I think. I just think if it's the Susan I'm thinking of from the David Hume Institute, then I think institutes like yours should make the lead on that and challenge the politicians to follow.
Andrew, thank you for that. I wanted now, because we've had some interest in the area of, you talked about working with developing countries, and that has been long a thrust over the centuries, really. here in Scotland and elsewhere. But we had a specific question, which I thought was well formulated, from Ramsey Kanati, who said global challenges cannot be solved on an individual level, not even on an individual national level, although I might add a footnote that they won't be solved at those levels, but they will be delivered on those levels. But let me go back to the question. He says, for plastic waste, for example, we see unprecedented level of collaboration between companies that formerly were deemed competitors, and they're now working together to complement their efforts in combating this challenge together. And the question is, will we see similar levels of collaboration across nations and their development institutions, banks, to address common challenges? So whoever would like to come in first, Willie, to give Andrew a brief.
I don't mind starting with that one, Susan. I think one of the things that is happening, certainly with listed companies around the world, is that shareholder activism is encouraging good behavior and punishing bad behavior. We had an example of a UK internet retail business recently, which had really bad supply chain management issues and sweatshops, etc. And the share price of that company was absolutely hammered. And my thoughts on collaboration at the business level, sectoral collaboration, is whilst in many senses businesses compete with each other within sectors, if sectoral collaboration can be perceived to have broader benefits, then I could see companies being rewarded in their share price for collaborating. So at the business level, I think there is quite a lot to encourage in thinking like that. In terms of development banks, I mean, we in our startup institution require to be humble because we are a startup, but we are absolutely committed to reaching out and networking with other such institutions around the world. And Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who from University College London, did a lot of the strategic thinking behind what became our bank. And she is someone who is very well networked in that world, and she's offered to help us with that. But I totally agree with what you said, Susan, that solutions require to be delivered on the ground in nations and regions, but that doesn't mean that the answers to the questions that need to be answered are not multinational or global. They absolutely are. So I think it's a bit of both.
Thank you very much for that. Andrew, do you want to pop in? I've got lots of questions, so
keep going. Yeah,
keep going. Okay, so these are two questions from Craig McKellar. He's asking, will the bank look to integrate the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, in all of their investments? Is that how it will go about its business? And then he specifically focused on you, Andrew, saying that it's very interesting, your thoughts about helping developing countries. And it just is, he explored in his question a little bit, is there a place for startups? Is there a place for, small entities to participate in that kind of help? And when you've finished with both of those questions, I want to say something about helping the developed, helping the developing. So I'm going to make myself a note so I don't forget. But why don't we go to you, Andrew, first on that, and then back to Willie on the SDGs.
No, I think it's a great question from Craig. Scotland is a relatively small country. We're obviously, a devolved government with the competence, for example, on international aid and development is with the United Kingdom. But an obvious thing to say is, in their recent spending review, the UK government decided to cut the commitment to the United Nations commitment to aid. The UK had done really well in recent years on this comparatively, but that's taken 4 billion out of support for the developing world. So that would be a good thing to reverse. I think supporting initiatives like the one I was mentioning from Leapfrog and others to tie up investment opportunities in developing countries. And to Willie's point, just actually to build understanding and engagement is really important, because the more you know, the more you spot the opportunities. And I think, from a Scottish, just for us, as from a perspective, we have for some time since devolution had a strong engagement with Malawi, and there will be other countries that we could pick to sort of specialize our relationship with. We can't obviously be everything to everywhere. The United Kingdom, the United States, and others can have diplomatic missions all around the world. We maybe could have development missions in just a few places where we specialize. These would be the things I might think about, but I do see a big role for the private sector here, because it's self-interest. The improvement of the developing world is in the interest of us. Beggaring one's neighbors never works for anyone, least of all oneself. So I think that would be I'm just trying to see if there's anything else to mention. I mean, technologically, the other big thing to say, whilst most of us are frustrated with the deglobalization trend of the behavior of governments, what's interesting in COVID is science has demonstrated unbelievable levels of collaboration across countries that actually are at loggerheads, including China in terms of the work. So there is hope there, and sometimes we maybe just need to bypass our governments and get on with it, which I think might be quite a good thought to end on.
Okay, we'll leave that one in the air. Willie, do you want to come in about the bank and SDGs?
Yeah, I was desperately racking my brain to remember how many SDGs there actually are. I think there might be 14, but no doubt our audience will be onto that very quickly. Every single one of them is worthy, and they are there for a good reason, to kind of guide countries and businesses and asset owners around the world. There are 17, I beg your pardon, even more than I thought. So the difficulty with setting an investment strategy based on 17 goals is it's complex. So that's the reason that we have focused on these missions. And if you think of our missions, they do map across to sustainable development goals. And so what we are doing is focusing on the things that in our part of the world, the experts and politicians, and indeed civic society generally, think are the most important things for a development bank to focus on. So innovation, inequality, and the transition to net zero are what we will focus on. Now, in doing that, we will also map across to other sustainable development goals. And so the way we plan to integrate all this together is to focus on our missions, but to be aware of the other goals. And when we report what we're doing as a business, to take that reporting into account.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I said I was going to say something about developed countries helping developing countries, and this is a maybe an odd perspective to anyone, but it just comes from a lot of my experience in banking, which is, of course, it's rational. It makes sense that those with, whether countries, companies, or whatever, those with greater resources, financial people, time, expertise, knowledge, can help those with less. And I think, all of us will say, of course, that should happen, and we need to see it happen more. But I would just say that having spent a lot of my banking career working in economic development in unbanked communities, both in America and then here, in trying to create financial products for those who have never used them, one should never underestimate the so-called developing part of the world. They will have other ways of dealing with some of the same goals than we have. And if we do go in to help, I would hope it's with the start of going in and listening and working out what their needs are, and not just assuming that their goals and their needs are exactly like our ones. So just a little sidebar, but I feel very strongly about that. Can I move a little bit over to, we've had several questions, particularly around ecosystems, biodiversity. Will the bank be involved? Can we do more than just think about being sustainable? So Marion Bruce asked a question, do we not want to aim to be regenerative? Our ecosystems and biodiversity status in Scotland are badly fragmented, degraded. So we need to restore those rather than just sustaining what we have. Should we change that word sustainable to the word regenerative? And Hugh Rainey has asked, what biodiversity standards does the bank have, or is it aiming for? Will it adopt an approach similar to IFC PS6? Willie, it may be too soon for you to answer the second part of that question, but I'm interested actually in the use of the word sustainable, because that is used and it means so many different things to different people. We all use sustainable and we all mean something different. So let's start with biodiversity, regenerative, but then take it from there.
Yes, it's in answer to your questioner, I was using sustainable in a very specific context. In the investment world from which I come, we use sustainability to be a measure, if you like, of the responsibility of a company for its environmental, societal and governance future. And so what we're really looking for are responsible companies, the kind that the other questioner talked about, collaborating to deal with plastic. So that was a very specific definition of sustainable. But in thinking about the questioner's positioning of sustainability versus regeneration, I could see that regeneration is part of being sustainable. If you can't regenerate your ecosystem, then it isn't sustainable. And I very much take the point on board that a lot of our natural environment in Scotland, Britain, Europe, the world has been degraded to a very significant extent and is not sustainable in any kind of kind of ecosystem sense. So regeneration is perfectly appropriate as the right way to think about that. In terms of how the bank thinks about that, you're absolutely right, Susan, to say that we haven't in our 4-week existence got to those kind of measures, if you will, of ecosystem. I'm searching for the right word. In the way that we will think about the ecosystem, but what we do think is that is important. I mean, our first thoughts are we should be doing no harm, in a Hippocratic sense, in terms of the investments that we make. There is also a big debate, which people on the call will know far more about than I, regarding carbon pricing and offset, and whether the regeneration of the natural world is an appropriate way for companies to offset. Now, I appreciate that there is no consensus around that, but talking to organizations that are owners of beneficial owners in a charitable sense of large parts of our countryside, they are certainly seeing that as a way in which they can get investment into the regeneration of the natural world in a way that could make it regenerative. Of course, it needs an appropriate carbon price, and that has been something that, you know, today has been missing. So I'm sorry, that sounds like a bit of a wandering answer, but it's the best one I can give at this point.
But no, it's a good answer, because the question covers something that's very big and broad, and it requires conversation and not simply an answer to an exam question. Andrew, let me turn to you about the use of the word sustainable, because you chaired Scotland's Sustainable Growth Commission a couple of years ago. What did you have in mind, and what did the government have in mind with that title?
I think it's a very good challenge that we've received. I mean, in my mind, you need transformation and regeneration to get to a sustainable place. Not just with the environment, of course, that's like self-evident, isn't it, that we require it when it comes to that. And stopping harming is one thing, but you then need to do the repair, as somebody's saying in this. I beg your pardon. I saw someone saying in the chat there. So I'm all with that. But there's also a sustainability issue around, like we were saying earlier with the banks. They weren't making profits sustainably, and that became crystal clear. It's true of almost all forms of profit making that doesn't take account of the long term. And I think that's the sort of underlying thought that keeps coming back to my mind as I think about things, which is, unless you think about things across a generation, then you aren't thinking sustainably. And the other big harm, of course, is that of inequality and unequal access to the benefits of the capital of the world, whether that's natural or financial. And what felt endurable has become completely unsustainable. And the idea that people could be kept poor, but their symptoms alleviated rather than their opportunities transformed is now for the birds. If it wasn't always, and I think that's a massive step forward, because we have no patience now for these harms that have led us to the position that we're in now, even before COVID. So these would be the ways I would begin to think about it. Just in response to one of the questions I see there around, as we're investing for this, do we need tax to do it? And I think my encouragement there would be to say, in a period of recovery, which will take minimum 5 years, I think, that the opportunity is to access cheap capital through borrowing, rather than to be thinking right this minute about increasing the tax burden, although that may come. Some of the most sustainable economies in Europe have much more substantial tax burdens, but people don't regard it as money badly spent, because the society is more equal, life is more livable, it's a more civilized place, thinking of countries obviously like Denmark and the other Nordics. So there are a number of different things to think through here. I do think, though, we should all collectively, whilst always having a discourse in the public debate which is courteous, we need to shorten our patience for populism, for people who are selling us a past that life can be done freely and easily. The solution here has to be big, long-term thinking and substantial investments in, yes, to your point, regeneration and transformation.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to stay in the natural world briefly, but change the focus a little bit. Tricia Bay has written Picking Up on the Themes of Plowmen and Carbon Neutral Targets, which put a smile on all our faces. She notes a recent report on agriculture in Scotland called Farming for 1.5 degrees centigrade. And the report calls for the engagement of the agricultural community in terms of absorbing emissions and so on. But she notes that the agricultural community is quite fragmented. It traditionally, in her view, doesn't get a great deal of support or attention from government or banks or policymakers. Is there any way or anything that we can do to alter that, to give them some of the tools and some of the direction that might be helpful?
I can pop straight back in there if you like, because this is something I've been giving thought to in the last 18 months with Scotland's Rural College becoming a rural university, who working within a project, and it's for them that we had the thought that the mission should be thinking about the natural economy of Scotland. Of course, food and drink is a huge part of it, our water, our sustainable energy as it transforms from carbon, obviously the marine opportunity too in terms of that. And what I noticed, if you look, and sorry, pause that thought, the second one is we've obviously got a very good education, higher education and further education system in Scotland, but it's currently unsustainable with COVID, and actually probably was anyway. We're very thinly spread in our expertise. We've got great institutions, but we're quite thinly spread. And when it comes to the support for the natural economy, the agriculture sector that Tricia mentions, the opportunity is vast. So we're cooking along with the idea of creating a national academy for the natural economy, which would be a combination of institutions collegiately. And actually, if you look at the strength of what Scotland has in terms of our research institutes, our education institutions across the board, our scientific innovation, also incidentally our commercialization, consultancy services to the farming and other natural economy sectors, that properly combined, we could become one of the top 3 or 4 institutions on the face of the planet, along with what exists in the Netherlands and also in Davis in California. So that's a big idea, which a small country could do if it does, again, what both Willie and Susan have referred to, which is just learn to collaborate, to have institutions not thinking solely about themselves, but to think about the longer term national mission for the country. So Tricia, I don't know if that's probably more than you bargained for in an answer, but by coincidence, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about just that sector. So hopefully you'll like that at the sound of that.
So the right question to the right person, Andrew. Let me move on again a little bit. Andrew Ross from Global Garden has asked, will the bank be engaged in issuing a sovereign green bond, municipal green bonds for Scotland? And alongside that question, Andy Kerr, hi Andy, from Climate Kick, has asked the question, or said that Climate Kick is working with cities, regions, local authorities across Europe and in Scotland, supporting their net zero plans. And there's a clear need to develop an investment mindset, which is that long-term mindset that you've just referred to, Andrew, 10 to 15-year investment thinking, to get beyond the incremental annual budget mindset that those in the public sector, and I can say those in the private sector, often have. So he's asking Willie and Andrew if he wants, but this is really addressed to you, Willie, to reflect on how best to blend public with private funds to deliver practical net zero outcomes in our cities and towns. So a little bit around place in these 2 questions.
Yes, I totally agree with the need to take an investment mindset, and these things will not be resolved by even taking a 5 or a 10-year view. Many of the investments that are required are 20 or 30 year in their outlook. Now, the good news is that there are far more investors that are interested in a very long-term time horizon than there have been for many years. And whilst what Andrew said earlier on is certainly true about the average life of an owner of a stock in the MSCI World Index or whatever, a lot of that is skewed towards very short-term index positions. But in infrastructure and in green infrastructure, there is a cadre of investors who are very keen to take a long-term view. What the bank can do is act as a catalyst. It can demonstrate that these long-term investments are viable commercially. The Green Investment Bank, which was set up in the UK some years ago, did this really well in the offshore wind space, where prior to the bank's creation, there was a problem in finding commercial finance for offshore wind. The Green Investment Bank pioneered that, and that allowed the private sector to come in and then invest multiples of what the Green Investment Bank had done. And I think that is a very good model that development banks could learn from, not only in our case, but more generally around the world. You're right, it does require governments to take more than a 1 or 2 year view of their budgets. But I think they do know that. And one of the things that development banks can do is work with government on sizing their time horizons with the requirements for investment. On the very specific point about sovereign bonds, it's probably one more for Andrew than myself. But the bank is not a sovereign. It is not a sovereign institution in the way that some sovereign wealth funds around the world are. It is a development bank, and therefore it can't either issue sovereign or municipal debt. But the bank does have an ambition to issue debt and to be a company that I mentioned earlier on that can crowd in external finance. But as a startup, it's going to take us some time to get into a position where that is a realistic possibility, and there are a number of requirements that we would need to meet before we could do that. And as it stands, we don't meet them at the moment, but it is certainly part of our ambition.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Andrew, do you want to add anything there, or will I move on?
Well, if you don't mind, just very briefly, just to the sort of annual budget point and then to the bonds point. In this little corner of the world in Scotland, we've had 13 electoral tests in one form or another in the last 10 years. So is it any wonder that politicians spend their life thinking about the next electoral test and not long term? And similarly, I do take Willie's point on shareholders, but if we think then just about company chief execs, average tenure about 5 years, so they tend to come in, they'll tend to make immediate cost cuts to get a quick hit on the share price. They'll then have a new strategy, and after 5 years, they'll leave with the financial incentives that they gear towards. So companies, as Susan said, are guilty of short-termism as well. I think the point on cities and places is mission critical. I know the David Hume Institute is giving thought to that just now, and a bit of a mention for Dark Matter Labs, who globally are thinking about this in cities around the world in different ways. Finally, on bonds, this is not a wealth tax, but it produces a similar outcome, which is to say, if we can allow, doesn't matter whether it's municipalities, indeed the Scottish government, or really any level of government, to access the historic opportunity that is there for very cheaply available capital and plentiful supply for a whole variety of reasons, and then invest that for a return, not just in the mission-led return that is Willie's mission, but also just in general for a return. If you can borrow so cheap and invest sustainably for the sort of returns that can be achieved commercially, but in the public interest, there is an opportunity then for the broader population to participate in investment in equity participation. Temasek in Singapore is a great example where they produce a big chunk of Singapore's public sector revenues from investment, and they do it very successfully. So I think that is really worth consideration and looking at the moment. It really is.
Thank you very much for that. I wanted to just throw a small point in, which you made me think of, Willie. You were talking about sort of governments and just the place of your kind of institution and what is actually, government doing something. I'm thinking back to the last decade when the major bank that I worked for here in the UK had pretty big and growing business providing finance to wind farm projects and others when they thought that they could. The early stage finance was always the real challenge, but they were willing to put money in if that early stage money came, and put it in for a period of time, sometimes up to 20 years, which is what's needed. And it was needed to make the numbers work as well, because an offshore wind farm is often, looks at a 25-year life. What happened was, because of things in the financial markets and elsewhere, and I'm not talking about the great financial crisis, but just because things were wobbling and whatever, regulators, for other reasons, made it very difficult for banks to extend credit for that length of time. And so there's something about I think pulling in all elements and aspects of government when you're doing something that, you know, the sort you're doing, so that everybody understands the unintended consequences if they in their own sphere need to make changes that will then have an impact in your sphere. So I thought of that when you were talking. Can I shift gears to a slightly different space? A couple of people have come in to ask about people, which I think is really important. So one question was, how will the bank develop people and technology dimensions within the bank to deliver the required products and returns and impact, because you're doing something different from a mainstream high street bank or a wholesale bank. And we have another question from Sheila O'Reilly. How will the bank actively involve a wider range of people, including those currently most disadvantaged in decision-making and monitoring, to ensure that the mission focus is not eclipsed by financial returns over time? And that, I think, is a highly complicated question for lots of reasons, but she ends by saying, are there plans for community engagement in decision making or strategically or around specific investments? And there's another question I'm just looking for on my list from yes, I think I've actually covered that. It was two different kinds of questions, but around people. How do you develop the people, and how do you involve people in what you're doing?
Yeah, I think in terms of development, it's an extremely good question, and one that we are actively wrestling with every day at the moment. We need to have professional investment skills. We are stewards of significant amounts of taxpayers' money, and we have to invest that money professionally. And it would be a dereliction of our responsibility if we did not do that. So we do need professional skills, and we will need to develop some of those skills ourselves, because a development bank will always have issues around attracting the right kind of skills. We also need skills around the missions. And those skills have been built up in the investment world over the last few years. And the UN PRI has become a global standard for investment skill development in sustainability and creating business models. So we need to employ people who have mission-based skills. Our chief executive, who we've recruited a few months ago, has significant experience in green infrastructure, and she has significant experience in social infrastructure. So it's a good start, and we're building a team around her. We've also put together a board which has significant relevant experience, including the European Investment Bank, the Development Bank of Wales, Leapfrog, the organisation that Andrew's already referenced, and I agree with everything he said about it, the Green Investment Bank, and other very professional organisations like that. So what we're trying to do is create a board and a management team that has the right skill sets to achieve the missions. As I said earlier on, we will not prioritise financial returns over missions. It is both. And don't forget that the returns that we make are reinvested in our company to be invested again in the missions. So any profit we make is profit that is then invested in missions. So there's no leakage here out of the system, by way of dividends or anything like that. So you know, your questioner can be confident that if we make a good return, it will be reinvested appropriately. Of course, we need to have strategic engagement with the people of Scotland. We have to be a long-term institution for the reasons that Andrew was talking about earlier on. And we require to be around for 20 or 30 or 40 years. And we will only do that if we are trusted by the people of Scotland and trusted by Civic Scotland as well as Business Scotland. So outreach and engagement and dialogue will be an important part of what we do. And we need to work out the best way to do that. But that is something that we'll be working on during the next few months, and you know, the fruits of that should be visible thereafter.
Willie, thank you very much. What I'm going to do now is just mention a couple of themes that have appeared in some questions. I'm mindful of the time, and we need to respect all of those, especially in different time zones, and finish more or less on time. So I will do two things. One is I'll mention these couple of themes. I'll ask each of you to spend a few minutes just pulling together your thoughts and giving us the main thoughts you want to leave us with. I will then do that and then finally return to Graham to conclude the event. However, I need to ask one question, which is a rhetorical question. So I'm not looking for an answer, but it comes from Simon Thompson from the Chartered Banker Institute. And it is this Christmas themed question, since this is a festive fireside chat. The headline from the CCC's 6th carbon budget report yesterday was the need to cut the UK's meat consumption, although Simon agrees that 1% of national income to significantly reduce emissions is probably more important. But Simon asks, who will be sitting down to vegetarian Christmas and New Year lunches this year? And is this a good example of where the carrot may be more important than the stick? So a humorous question, but I think something quite profound underneath it. So Simon, thank you for that. Could I now turn to Andrew, if you could just pull your thoughts together. Some of the remaining questions had themes that I think are around boundaries. You know, will the bank, is there political consensus? Are you likely to lose funding? Will you fund organizations that are not registered in Scotland, you know, that operate around the UK? What about procurement? How does any of us ensure that our supply chain and procurement are following the same precepts that we would follow? So I won't look for details on that, but wanted to recognize those questions as well. Andrew, over to you for a few minutes to wrap up.
Thank you very much, and to Jeff very much for the opportunity to be with you all. It's been a great conversation and appreciated. Simon, I suppose I believe in carrot more than stick. You know, telling your kids the story of the sun taking on the wind and the sun always winning. I think that's what I have front of mind, certainly for as we develop as human beings, although the stick is always needed to stop bad behavior, not amongst kids. Hasten to add, we've just banned that in Scotland. The other thing to say is opportunity right now is far greater than the threat. It doesn't feel like it to listen to the public discourse, to watch the media, but the opportunities in the world, you know, we've never had less conflict on the planet than we've got at the moment. And so I think optimism matters. Populism and short-termism are our two biggest enemies. And we need to back those leaders who have got the guts and the honesty to tell us that change takes time, that it involves trade-off that can be difficult, but in the end, it will be worth it. There's a great, I don't know, I really hope this is true. I know there are people on here from the Indian subcontinent, so correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the Sanskrit symbol for funeral pyre is exactly the same as the Sanskrit symbol for worry. And the reason for this is because one burns the dead while the other one burns the living. I think all of us have had enough of worry and been burned by it. And I think as we look to the future, it's time to put action in the place where worry lies. And back to that Burns poem, let's stop guessing and fearing about the future. Let's get on with determining it. And I think that's the biggest thought as we face 2021 for all of us, no matter where we are.
Andrew, thank you very, very much for that. Willie, some closing thoughts from you.
Well, it's been a very enjoyable afternoon, and I'd like to thank everyone who's asked questions, and to Andrew and Susan for what they've said. It's been really thought-provoking. I guess we are an ambitious startup organization that's been created by the people of our country to be a practical response to the challenges that our country faces. So those mission-based challenges that I've mentioned 2 or 3 times, they are real, they've been around a long time, and they need to be addressed. So it's clear, I think, from what everyone has said, that there is the requirement to address those, not just for 1 or 2 or 3 years, but address them with vigor for a long period of time. And only through doing that will we actually achieve the kind of change that we require. The but is that the early stages of that long term are really important. And that is why COP26 is really important. And that is why what a startup organization like ours does in its first few years is also really important, albeit at a completely different scale. So our challenge is to turn the ambition and the promise into a reality, and that's what we'll be focusing on doing. We can't be all things to all people. We're in a little bit of a honeymoon period at the moment. We will have to make difficult choices as to where we deploy our capital, but I think the missions are a great guide, and that they will keep us on the right path.
Willie, thank you very much for that. And I will give a few closing thoughts as well. And like you, I want to thank absolutely everybody, our colleagues at Jeffy, who just do an amazing job in my eyes in convening. The convening power is extraordinary, to bring people together to focus and talk about in a very real, tangible way issues that matter hugely to all of us, and all of us really across the globe, hence the audience, the people who've joined us today. So can I thank all of you, even though I can't see you, but thank you, and thank those of you who put some questions in as well. So that was one thought. The second is that I think history probably tells us that after major crises, which I think we have seen this year with the pandemic, there's almost always a massive shift in how we live and what we value. Things really do change. There is a stepping stone change then. And so therein lies for me an existential opportunity for change that doesn't happen every year. We can talk about change, but right now we have that moment. And the opportunity possibly to lead change. And I think that that is a cause for optimism and indeed hope and festive cheer, but above all, hope as we look ahead to next year. I would say that we've heard a lot about opportunities today. I'm a carrot person as well. I'm an optimist by nature. I'm always looking for the good that can happen, the way forward. How do you get around a problem? You know, you don't just walk into the barrier, you find a way around it. Opportunity always exists, even in really tough times, but we need to be really good at how to read the signs, how to interrogate the data, if you will, to see what can productively emerge from where we are. And we need to allow ourselves to test and experiment. And I think that's part of what we were hearing today. And I'd like to close just by saying that listening to this conversation and everything that Andrew and Willie have said really makes me very proud of the efforts that are made in Scotland. So some years ago, in the early part of the last decade, the Scottish Parliament unanimously voted for the most aggressive timescale for lowering carbon emissions of any country in the world. There has been an ongoing dialogue over time about ways to address climate change specifically, and more widely and more recently, wider areas of social need. It really does make you proud to be part of that. And it makes me think there is something sometimes about size, that a small country where people know each other, people can speak to each other, people can see the challenge quickly, can come together and can make some things happen. So Andrew, continued good luck with the work that you do and all those whom you advise. Willie, the very best of luck as you get this bank off the ground and running. I'll be watching all of that very closely. Thank you again, and Graham, over to you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think all that really remains is for me to say a few words of thanks. First and foremost to our panel of speakers today, who have undoubtedly given us a most engaging and, as Willie said a couple of moments ago, thought-provoking discussion, and have offered us at least a few reasons to be cheerful. Given our particularly widespread audience today, we were hoping to explore both the local and global perspectives, and the panel, I think, have addressed both of these to great effect. And particular appreciation to you, Susan, for simultaneously contributing to the discussion and handling the challenging task, as I well know, of grappling in real time with the large number of questions that came in, and which demonstrated, I think, the level of audience engagement. Thanks also to our own Jeffy team behind the scenes. These events don't happen by themselves, and we're very grateful for all their hard work in pulling things together. And last but not least, thanks to all of you for attending today. We are very pleased indeed to have had such a large and varied audience for this event. Can I briefly mention before we close that another reason to be cheerful is that we will be hosting a further series of these roundtable meetings next year. We already have a date for the first of these, namely 18th February 2021, and provisionally at least a topic which will be net zero accounting, myth or reality. Plenty of room for debate there, I'm sure, and full details will be circulated to you all nearer the time. For now, though, can I, on behalf of Jeffy, close by wishing our panel and all of you a very Merry Christmas, so far as we are permitted, and a very cheerful New Year.